The wine was a Bordeaux 2018, the kind Gerald ordered without looking at the price because looking at the price was something other people did. He stood at the head of the table, our table at Alcott's, the restaurant he'd chosen and reserved and insisted on paying for, and lifted his glass with the practiced ease of a man who had made many toasts in many rooms and knew exactly how to fill one. The other guests leaned in slightly. His wife Carol smiled from the chair beside him, the specific smile of a woman who had watched her husband perform this particular gesture many times and still found it charming. "To Ryan," Gerald said, his voice carrying that low, confident register that I had spent 9 years at Harman and Associates learning to interpret. "And to Nadia. 9 years. In this business, in this world, 9 years of anything is worth celebrating." Laughter. Glasses raised. The warm clink of crystal moving around the table. I smiled and reached for Nadia's hand. She gave it to me, fingers closing around mine in the automatic way of long habit, but her eyes were somewhere else. I felt it before I saw it. A slight tension in her grip, not affectionate but bracing, like someone holding on to stay steady rather than to connect. I turned to look at her and she was already lifting her glass, her gaze traveling smoothly past me toward the centerpiece, toward the middle distance, toward anywhere that wasn't Gerald's face or mine. That detail, I've turned it over so many times since. The way she managed not to look at either of us in the same moment. It required a specific, practiced geometry of avoidance. You don't develop that kind of precision by accident. I told myself she was tired. She'd had a difficult week with a client revision that had dragged on, and she'd mentioned a headache on the drive over. I was good at finding explanations that fit the shape of what I needed to believe. Gerald sat back down and the conversation resumed its normal current, project timelines, the Colorado real estate market, someone's recent ski trip to Telluride. I was present for all of it in the way that I was always present at these dinners. Attentive, engaged, professionally warm. Gerald had been my direct superior for 6 of my 9 years at the firm. I reported to him, learned from him, had been shaped in no small part by the way he moved through professional spaces. I respected him in the uncomplicated way you respect someone whose approval has materially affected the trajectory of your life. Carol asked Nadia about a design project she'd mentioned at the last dinner, and Nadia answered with the animation she reserved for talking about her work. Hands moving slightly, voice finding a register that was more genuinely her than her social register. I watched her the way I always watched her in company, with a quiet, private pride. She was good in rooms. She made people feel like the conversation had improved since she entered it. But she didn't look at Gerald when he laughed at something she said. And he didn't look at her either. Not obviously. Not in the way that would have registered as anything at the time. Just a studied neutrality between two people seated 4 chairs apart, both of whom were excellent at managing surfaces. I registered it somewhere below conscious thought. Filed it with no label attached. Lily had been with Nadia's mother that evening, our standing arrangement for the occasional late dinner. 6 years old, already with opinions about everything from breakfast cereal to which park had the better climbing structure. She had her mother's face and, I had always believed, my stubbornness, which was a combination I found privately wonderful. She was the best thing in my life, and I had never for a moment been ambiguous about that. The dinner ran until nearly 11. Gerald paid without ceremony. We stood on the sidewalk in the October cold while the valets brought cars around, and Gerald shook my hand with both of his, the double grip he used when he wanted to convey sincerity, and said it had been a good evening. Carol hugged Nadia. Nadia hugged back. In the car, I asked her if she was feeling better. "A little," she said, and turned to look out the passenger window at the passing streetlights. I drove us home through the quiet Fort Collins streets and didn't ask anything else. That was 9 months ago. What I know now about that dinner could fill a room. At the time, I knew only what I allowed myself to know. That something had felt slightly wrong in a way I couldn't name, and that the inability to name it was, in itself, a kind of answer I wasn't ready to receive. The headache, the tired week, the client revision. I believed every word of it. Or rather, and this is the more accurate thing, I chose to. Fort Collins in November has a particular quality of light, low and flat in the mornings, gone by 5 in the afternoons, leaving the streets in a premature dark that made the houses look more sealed than they were. I drove to the Harmon and Associates office on Prospect Road every weekday at 7:40, returned by 6:30, helped with Lily's dinner and bath on the nights Nadia had client calls, and spent my evenings with a kind of productive quiet that I had always considered one of the better features of my character. We had a good life. I believed that then, and I don't entirely disbelieve it now, which is one of the stranger things to sit with. Good lives can contain very bad things and remain, in most of their dimensions, structurally sound. The difficulty is that you can't always tell the difference between a structure that is sound and one that has been maintained to look that way. Nadia worked from the studio she'd built in the back bedroom, a proper setup with a large monitor, a tablet, reference books stacked in the particular disorder of someone who actually used them. She was talented in a way that was easy to take for granted because she made it look natural. Corporate branding, editorial illustration, the occasional book cover. She had a small client list she'd cultivated carefully and protected fiercely, and she ran that part of her life with an independence I had always admired and never thought to question. Gerald had been in and out of our lives socially for years. The firm held quarterly dinners, occasional weekend events, and Gerald maintained a personal warmth with his senior staff that kept the boundary between professional and social perpetually slightly blurred. It was part of how he operated, intimate enough to inspire loyalty, calibrated enough never to actually become friendship. I understood the mechanism. I had benefited from it. I had simply never considered that it might be operating on someone other than me. There were things I noticed in November and December that I assembled into a coherent picture only much later. Nadia began going to the gym on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. This was not new. She had always been someone who exercised with discipline, but the timing shifted, and the duration stretched from 45 minutes to closer to 2 hours. She returned flushed and quiet in a way I attributed to the workout. I did not think about it further. She bought a new dress in December that she described as being for an upcoming client meeting. It was a specific shade of deep green that I remembered thinking was unusual for a client meeting but not unusual enough to mention. She wore it on a Wednesday and came home later than expected, explaining a dinner that had run long. I heeded her portion of what I'd made and left it on the counter without comment. Looking back at that Wednesday now, knowing what I know, I understand that the dress was not for a client. And the dinner was real, just not the one she described. That particular red flag, which seemed like nothing more than a fashion choice at the time, was actually the first moment I could have asked a direct question and received an answer that would have changed everything. I didn't ask. I heated the food and went to bed. The second thing I noticed was Gerald's behavior at the office. This one was subtler, the kind of shift that is invisible unless you've spent years learning to read someone professionally. He had always been generous with his attention during check-ins, the kind of manager who made you feel like your project was the most important thing on his desk. But in November, he became slightly more formal with me. Not cold, Gerald was never cold, but a degree more correct. More measured. The easy warmth dialed back just enough to be noticeable if you were paying the right kind of attention. I interpreted it as pressure from above. The Q4 numbers were tight, and I knew the board was involved in conversations about restructuring one of our regional contracts. It made sense that Gerald would be operating more carefully. I told myself that and moved on. I think about that now, how I handed him an explanation he hadn't even asked for. How efficient that was. How much work it saved everyone. The Christmas party was the third thing. Harmon and Associates held its annual party at the Hilton on College Avenue. The kind of corporate event that everyone attended and no one particularly enjoyed. Nadia had come to 4 of these over the years. That year she declined. A design deadline she'd committed to before the date was confirmed. She said, I went alone, stood with my colleagues through 2 hours of catered indifference, and spent much of it talking to Pete from Contracts about his renovation project. Gerald arrived late, which was unusual. He was polished and controlled in the way he always was in company. But there was something slightly compressed about his effect that evening, something operating just below the surface of his usual ease. His wife Carol wasn't with him. He'd mentioned she had a prior commitment. At one point I caught him looking at his phone with an expression I couldn't read from across the room. Focused and private, the face of someone receiving news from a world that had nothing to do with the Hilton ballroom. Then he put the phone in his pocket and turned back to the conversation he was having with someone from the legal team, and the expression was gone. I thought nothing of it. By January, I had collected without realizing it a small inventory of unexamined things. A green dress, a shifted gym schedule, a change in Gerald's professional register, a phone expression at a Christmas party. None of them connected. None of them pointed anywhere. And then Lily got sick. It was a Thursday in late January, stomach flu, the aggressive kind that announces itself at 2 in the morning and doesn't apologize. Lily had woken up crying and I'd heard her before Nadia did. I was always the lighter sleeper, and gone to her room while Nadia slept on. I spent the next hour and a half on the bathroom floor with my daughter, holding her hair back, running cold water, talking to her quietly about things that didn't matter. Her stuffed animals, the fort we were going to build on the weekend, whether clouds were actually soft or just looked soft from far away. She asked me that last question at about 3:30 in the morning with her head on my knee, half asleep, and I told her I thought they probably felt like wet cotton, and she said that sounded disappointing. Nadia appeared in the doorway at 4, eyes adjusting to the light. She took in the scene, me on the floor, Lily asleep against my side, and something moved across her face. Not quite guilt, something adjacent to it. The expression of a person who has arrived late to something they should have been present for and knows it. "I didn't hear her," she said. "It's fine," I said. "Go back to sleep." She stood there a moment longer. Then she did. I sat on that bathroom floor for another 30 minutes after Lily fell fully asleep, long enough to be certain she'd stay settled. And in that particular silence of a house at 4 in the morning, I thought about my wife standing in the doorway with that expression, and I felt, for the first time, something that wasn't confusion or vague discomfort. I felt the specific, cold clarity of a question I had been refusing to ask. I didn't act on it that night. Lily needed tending to, and I needed sleep, and the morning would bring its own logistics. But something had shifted in me in that bathroom, something that wouldn't shift back. In February, I started paying a different quality of attention. Not surveillance. Not yet. Just the decision to stop handing out free explanations. I noticed that Nadia's Tuesday and Thursday gym sessions coincided, almost perfectly, with the evenings Gerald's assistant had marked him as off-site on the shared office calendar, which I had legitimate access to for project scheduling purposes. I noticed this once, then twice, then on 3 consecutive weeks. 3 data points don't constitute proof, but they constitute a pattern, and I had spent my professional life learning to trust patterns. I noticed that she had started using a second email account. I found it by accident when she left herself logged into the shared laptop, a personal account I'd never seen before, displaying only a partial subject line before I closed the screen. I closed it immediately. The subject line had contained only Gerald's first name and a time. I closed the screen and sat very still for a moment. My hands were flat on the desk. I looked at them. There was a period, maybe 30 seconds, maybe longer, where I could have opened the laptop again. Could have looked. Could have known everything right then, in February, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon while Lily was at school and Nadia was at a supposed client meeting. I closed the laptop and walked out of the room. Not because I wasn't ready to know, but because I understood in that moment that how I learned this and what I did with the knowledge would matter enormously. I was a project manager. I built timelines. I understood the difference between acting on impulse and acting with precision. If what I suspected was true, I needed to know it completely, not in pieces, not with room for denial. And then I needed to be very, very careful about what came next. Something had entered me in that room. Not rage, though that would come later. Something colder and more durable. The quiet, organizing certainty of someone who has finally decided to actually look at the structure they've been living inside. The question was no longer, is something happening? The question was, how long and what exactly, and what does that mean for everything I do next? Lily had her school recital that Friday. She played a xylophone piece she'd been practicing for 3 weeks, eyes down on the keys with a concentration that made the whole audience go tender. Nadia sat beside me in the auditorium and filmed it on her phone. When Lily looked up at the end, she found us both immediately in the crowd and waved with her whole arm. I waved back and felt something I can't adequately describe. A split-screen experience of profound love and absolute devastation running simultaneously, neither one canceling the other. I looked straight ahead. I did not look at Nadia. I want to be precise about what I did and what I didn't do in the weeks that followed. because there's a version of this story where the husband becomes something he isn't proud of, and I was conscious every step of not becoming that. I did not read her messages. I did not follow her. I did not hire anyone or install anything or access anything I didn't have legitimate reason to access. What I did was watch and remember and verify the things that could be verified without crossing lines I wasn't willing to cross. The office calendar remained my most reliable tool. Gerald's off-site notations were entered by his assistant, Priya, who was meticulous and consistent. Over a 6-week period, I tracked 12 instances where his schedule showed external meetings without specified locations, running between 5 and 8 in the evening. I cross-referenced these against Nadia's gym nights, her client dinners, her late studio sessions, all of which she reported to me with the same flat, functional delivery she used for grocery lists and school pickup schedules. 10 of the 12 dates aligned. I sat with that number for a long time. I also spoke to Pete from contracts, not about this, never about this, but about Gerald. I asked, in the practiced casual way of someone making professional conversation, whether Gerald had seemed different to him lately. Pete was quiet for a moment and then said, carefully, "He's been managing something, but he's always managing something." He changed the subject with a smoothness that made me think he knew more than he was offering. I let it go. Pete wasn't a source. He was a signal. The harder investigation was internal. Because alongside everything I was learning about Gerald and Nadia, I was also slowly being forced to learn something about myself. I had known, on some level, since the anniversary dinner. Not consciously. Not in a form I could have articulated to anyone. But the information had been available to me, in the way she hadn't met my eyes, in the geometry of how she'd avoided looking at both of us simultaneously, and I had looked at it and then looked away. Every subsequent red flag, from the green dress to the gym schedule to the Christmas party phone expression, had passed through a filter I had constructed for the specific purpose of making inconvenient things disappear. That filter was made of love and investment, and the particular terror of a man who has organized his entire adult life around a version of things that he cannot afford to have be untrue. I understood then, sitting with those 12 calendar entries, that denial isn't a failure of intelligence. It's a failure of courage dressed up as normalcy. I had been intelligent enough to notice every single warning. I had simply been afraid of what noticing would require me to do. In the 3rd week of March, I retained a family law attorney named Susan. I chose her based on 3 things: her reputation in Fort Collins, the fact that she had never done any work connected to Harmon and Associates, and the quality of stillness she brought to our first conversation. She didn't rush me. She let me speak until I was finished and then asked 5 questions with the precision of someone who had sat across from many people in my situation and understood exactly what they needed to know. "Do you want to save the marriage?" she asked at the end. I thought about it for longer than she expected. "No," I said. "I want to protect my daughter." She nodded. "Then let's talk about what that looks like." We talked for 2 hours. I left her office with a clear picture of what the next several months needed to look like if I was going to emerge from this with Lily's life intact and my own position solid. The financial structure of our marriage was not complicated. We had joint accounts, a jointly owned home, and the significant income differential that came from my corporate salary versus Nadia's freelance earnings. What complicated it was Gerald. Because Gerald was not just the man sleeping with my wife. Gerald was the man who controlled my career. And that meant the way I handled this needed to be very, very precise. I said nothing at work. I performed my role with the same quality of professional engagement I had always brought to it. I sat in Gerald's Tuesday briefings and received his feedback and thanked him for his input with exactly the tone I had always used, and I watched him and I kept everything I knew in a room inside myself with the door locked. He had no idea. That was the one unexpected thing about this period. That I was good at it. Better than I expected. I had spent 9 years learning to manage my affect in professional spaces, to hold complex information without letting it change my surface. I had learned from Gerald himself, in fact. There was something almost elegant about applying his own lessons to the project of dismantling his position. At home, I was present. I helped with Lily's homework. I cooked 2 nights a week. I did not pick fights. I did not grow cold or distant in ways that would raise Nadia's alarm. I was, by every visible measure, the same man I had always been. Inside, I was building something. Quietly, methodically, with the care of someone who understands that timing is everything and a premature move costs more than a patient one. April arrived, and with it the firm's quarterly review, the one where Gerald presented performance assessments to the board and compensation decisions were made for senior staff. I had been in line for a promotion for 18 months. The associate director title, the salary adjustment, the expanded portfolio. Gerald had mentioned it 3 times in the past year in terms that were encouraging without being specific. I was not promoted. The explanation Gerald gave me privately was about budget constraints and timing. His manner was professional and warm, as it always was. He looked me in the eye. I thanked him and returned to my desk and sat down and felt the last remaining ambiguity burn away entirely. This was not just a man who had been sleeping with my wife. This was a man who had been using his position over me to manage the entire situation, maintaining my professional dependency, keeping me financially grateful, ensuring I remained in a posture of need relative to him. He had calculated that I would stay. He was wrong. Gerald Harmon's management style had one consistent vulnerability, and I had known about it for years without ever thinking I would need to use it. He kept everything close. He was the decision-maker on all significant contracts, the relationship holder with all major clients, the institutional memory for every major deal the firm had done in the past decade. He did this because proximity to information was the source of his power, and distributing it would have diluted that power. It was effective, and it was also, from a risk management perspective, a structural flaw. A single point of failure in a system that looked solid from the outside. Over my 9 years at Harmon & Associates, I had been the person Gerald trusted with operational details precisely because I was good at them and because he had believed, correctly until recently, that my loyalty was secure. That trust had given me access to a great deal of information that I had never before thought to examine for its strategic value. In April and May, I began examining it. I also had 3 conversations with board members, the kind of low-key professional contact that was entirely within my normal scope of activity, in which I managed to communicate without stating anything directly that I had a comprehensive operational picture of the firm's major projects and client relationships and that I was interested in the firm's long-term structure. The board had already had concerns about Gerald's concentration of relationships. I didn't create those concerns. I simply made sure they had a reason to think about their resolution. In the middle of May, Susan filed. Nadia received the papers on a Tuesday morning, after I had left for work. I was in a meeting when my phone lit up with her name and I let it go to voicemail. Then again. Then a text. Ryan, please call me. I finished the meeting. Then I called her back. The conversation was 5 minutes. She was not angry, she was afraid, which was different, and told me more about the state of things than anger would have. She asked me when I'd known. I told her long enough to do this right. She asked if there was anything, if we could, and I said no, directly, without qualification. She was quiet for a long moment and then said my name in a way that had something final in it. Lily, she said. Lily is going to be fine, I said. I'm going to make sure of that. I meant it. Everything I had done in the past 3 months had been organized around making that true. 3 days later, Gerald called me into his office. He'd learned about the filing. Fort Collins was not a large professional community, and he sat across from me with the specific composure of a man who had expected to remain untouchable and was realizing he had miscalculated. He didn't admit anything. Neither did I. We sat across from each other in the office where he had, for 6 years, shaped the contours of my professional life, and we had a conversation about business continuity and transition timelines and the importance of managing client relationships through periods of organizational change. I was very professional about it. What I had given the board was not an ultimatum. It was a demonstration, a quiet, documented, thoroughly organized demonstration of what institutional knowledge looked like when the person holding it was no longer invested in protecting the current structure. The board had drawn their own conclusions. Gerald had been asked to step back from client-facing responsibilities pending a review that had been initiated without my fingerprints anywhere near it. I left his office and walked back to my desk and sat down and looked out the window at the May sky over Fort Collins. Pale blue, unmarked, the kind of day that doesn't commit to anything. I had not destroyed him. I hadn't needed to. I had simply removed the conditions that made his position stable and let the structure do what compromised structures do when you stop holding them up. The meeting with Susan that afternoon ran 3 hours. The preliminary terms were detailed and, for Nadia, considerably less comfortable than the life she had been living. The house went into the settlement calculation at its current market value. The accounts were analyzed. My attorney had been thorough. Nadia had her own representation, and those conversations were handled through proper channels, as they should be. I did not negotiate with her directly. I did not need to make it personal. The paperwork was personal enough. At 6 o'clock, I picked Lily up from my mother-in-law's, where she'd been since the previous day. She climbed into the back seat with her backpack and informed me that Grandma had made the wrong kind of pasta. "What kind did she make?" I asked. "The bow tie kind. I like the regular kind." "I'll note that," I said. She buckled herself in and looked out the window. After a moment she said, "Dad, is everything going to be different now?" I looked at her in the rearview mirror, her small, serious face, her mother's eyes, that expression of careful attention that she'd had since she was 3 years old. "Some things will be different," I said. "The important things will stay the same." She seemed to think about that. "Which things are the important things?" "You," I said. "That's the whole list." She nodded like this was satisfactory and went back to looking out the window. I drove us home through the familiar streets of Fort Collins in the early summer evening, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not happiness, not relief, not any of the emotions I had imagined arriving at this stage. Just an absence. The specific, quiet absence of something that had been taking up enormous space and was now, finally, gone. The divorce was finalized in September. Susan had done her job with the precision I'd hired her for. The settlement reflected the financial reality of the marriage, my income, the equity in the house, the accounts, and because Nadia's freelance income had been inconsistently documented over the years, the numbers fell significantly in my favor. I was not vindictive about it. I was accurate about it. There is a difference, and I held onto that distinction carefully. Primary residential custody of Lily went to me, with generous scheduled time for Nadia. That was the outcome I had organized everything around, and when Susan called to confirm it was final, I sat at my kitchen table with the phone in my hand for a long time without saying much. "You did well," Susan said. "She'll be okay," I said. I was talking about Lily. Gerald had left the firm in July. The board review had concluded in a way that made his continued involvement untenable, and he had resigned with the kind of quiet, face-saving departure that powerful men arrange when the alternative is worse. His professional network had contracted significantly. Carol had filed separately, in another county, which I learned through a mutual acquaintance and did not pursue further. Whatever happened between them was their own accounting to make. Nadia moved into an apartment on the east side of the city. She had lost the house, which had been the primary marital asset, and the adjustment was visible in her face the first few times she came to pick up Lily. A stripped-down quality, like someone learning to occupy a smaller life. I was not cruel about it. I was courteous in the way that exes can be when they've decided that decency costs less than combat. What I hadn't expected was how much of the aftermath would be about Lily rather than about either of us. She adapted with the resilience that children deploy when they have no alternative, but she also carried things in the particular quiet way she carried things, processing by accumulation rather than by expression, until something tipped the balance. In October she asked me, on an unremarkable Tuesday evening while I was making dinner, whether it was her fault that we didn't live together anymore. I turned off the stove. I sat down at the table across from her. "No," I said. "Not even a little bit. Not in any universe. Sometimes kids at school say it's the kid's fault," she said. "Kids at school are wrong about this one," I said. She looked at me with that careful, measuring expression. Was it Mom's fault? I thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest and also something a 6-year-old could carry without it being too heavy. "Grown-ups make mistakes," I said. "Big ones sometimes, and sometimes those mistakes change things that can't be changed back. But none of that has anything to do with you. You are the thing neither of us made a mistake about." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Okay." She slid off the chair and went back to her drawings on the living room floor, and I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the turned-off stove and thought about the strange mercy of children who accept what they're given and move on. Gerald sent me an email in November. Professional in tone, brief, the kind of message that is really about the sender managing their own narrative rather than any genuine communication. He said he hoped I was well and that he had always valued my work at the firm. I read it once and archived it without responding. There was nothing in it worth answering. I had been promoted in August by the new acting director, who had a much clearer view of what I brought to the firm than his predecessor had ever had reason to demonstrate. The title was what it should have been 18 months earlier. The salary reflected the actual value of what I'd been doing. I didn't feel satisfaction about it exactly, more a flat, factual recognition that things had landed where they should have. The strange thing about walking away from a long deception, even one you were the victim of, is that you don't feel clean afterward. You feel different, lighter in some respects, heavier in others. There are things you know about yourself after a year like that one that you didn't know before, and not all of them are comfortable. I know that I am capable of more patience than I would have claimed. I know that I can hold something enormous and keep it perfectly still on the surface while everything underneath is working. I know that the qualities that make me good at my job and the qualities that allowed me to delay dealing with my marriage for too long are, at their root, the same qualities, a preference for controlled outcomes over honest confrontations. That's not a comfortable thing to know about yourself. But it's a real thing and I'd rather know it. By December, Lily and I had settled into a life that had its own rhythms. Different from what had come before, but not lesser. She had opinions about dinner, about weekend plans, about which route we should take to school. She had her mother's social confidence and her father's attention to detail, and she was, in her 6-year-old way, the most complete person I knew. One evening in December she asked me what snow tasted like, and I took her outside in the backyard and we stood there in the cold with our heads tilted back and caught snowflakes on our tongues. She informed me it tasted like water but better. Yeah, I said. That's about right. We stood there a little longer than we needed to, in the quiet dark of a December yard, and I thought about none of what had happened that year and all of what was standing right in front of me. The structure held. A different structure than the one I had built, but stronger in the ways that mattered. Some things you don't recover. Some things you replace with something truer. The hardest part is learning to tell the difference before you've spent too long holding up walls that were never going to stand. There is a particular kind of betrayal that operates on multiple levels simultaneously, and what makes this story so difficult to look away from is that it doesn't ask you to simply judge a cheating wife or a corrupt boss. It asks something more uncomfortable. How does a capable, intelligent person end up living inside a lie for months without seeing it? The answer, in Ryan's case, isn't naivety. He was not a man who lacked the ability to read situations. He was a man who had organized his life around a version of things that required certain questions not to be asked. His professional identity was bound to Gerald's approval. His domestic identity was bound to Nadia's constancy. Both of those dependencies created a single point of vulnerability. The moment either structure showed signs of stress, he had a deeply practiced system for explaining that stress away. What makes this more layered than a simple deception story is that Gerald was not just the man sleeping with Ryan's wife. He was the architect of Ryan's professional dependency. That detail, which might seem like dramatic excess, is actually the most psychologically precise element of the story. The affair thrived not just because of desire, but because of power dynamics that were already in place. Gerald didn't need to actively suppress Ryan's suspicion. The financial and professional structure he controlled did that automatically. Ryan couldn't afford, in any practical sense, to see clearly. So he didn't. That's not weakness. It's the mathematics of a trapped position. Nadia's culpability is real and it's specific. She didn't stumble into something accidental. She sustained a deliberate double life for the better part of a year, in close proximity to her daughter, her husband, and her own stated values. The green dress detail, the gym schedule calibrated to match Gerald's off-site evenings, the second email account, these were not lapses of judgment. They were a constructed architecture of deception that required daily maintenance. Whatever she told herself to justify it, the operational reality of what she built was cold and deliberate. And yet, the question that lingers, and the one this story earns the right to ask, is what she was looking for. Not to excuse the choice, but to understand the vacancy that made it feel like an answer. Ryan was present, reliable, professionally engaged. He was also, by his own eventual admission, a man who confused not fighting with closeness and task-sharing with intimacy. He performed the functional dimensions of a partner with precision and left the emotional dimensions to manage themselves. That gap was real. It didn't justify what Nadia did, but it was the space in which what she did became possible. The point of no return in this story isn't the anniversary dinner, though that's where the geometry of avoidance became visible. It's the bathroom floor at 4 in the morning, when Nadia appeared in the doorway and Ryan felt something shift permanently. Because in that moment he didn't see a tired wife who'd overslept. He saw a woman who had arrived late to her own child's illness and carried something in her face that looked like conscience rather than concern. Something crossed in him then that didn't uncross. What Ryan ultimately demonstrates is a kind of emotional intelligence that operated on a significant delay. He had it. He applied it too late to save the marriage, but precisely enough to protect the one thing he'd always been clearest about. Lily runs through this story as the North Star, the constant that kept his decisions organized when everything else was in flux. Every choice he made, from hiring Susan to timing the filing to managing the board situation, was oriented around her stability. That's not revenge. That's parenthood with very clean priorities. The final irony is that Gerald's system of concentrated power, the same mechanism he used to maintain control over Ryan's professional life, became the instrument of his own removal. Ryan didn't need to expose the affair. He simply stopped holding up the structure Gerald had built and let it fall under its own weight. Here's what I keep thinking about when I turn this story over. Not the betrayal itself. Betrayal is, unfortunately, a story as old as people. What gets me is the anniversary dinner. Gerald stood up and toasted 9 years of marriage to the man he was sleeping with his wife behind, and he did it smoothly, warmly, with both hands around his wine glass. And Nadia sat there and received it. That takes something. A specific kind of compartmentalization that most of us couldn't sustain for 30 seconds, let alone through a full dinner. And the question that leaves me with isn't how could they, it's what do we miss when the people beside us have learned to manage their surfaces that well? Maybe the warning isn't in the big moments. Maybe it's in the small ones, the pause before the answer, the gaze that finds the centerpiece instead of your face, the grip that holds on for balance instead of warmth. We feel those things. We just have to decide we're going to trust what we feel.